of the people that led the 1930s upsurge were young workers, and particularly kids of immigrants. And you see, it's not exactly the same today, but it's very similar, and I think that's very promising. And I'll just say one last piece, because there was a lot of doom, before I talk about the distributed, there was a lot of doom and gloom about Gen Z after the election. You remember this was like, all the kids are, they're all into the manosphere, at least, young men. You know what I'm talking about, right? I mean, you see some nods. Okay, it's like post-lunch malaise, and I'm trying to make sure everyone's awake. But you remember, everyone's like, oh yeah, they're turning to the right, they're all just listening to Rogan or whatever. And in the back of my mind, I was like, maybe there's some of that, but my anecdotal impression also, because I'm deeply embedded in this young left world, it's like, I don't know, I feel like the kids are still good. And I would just say, even though it's not a labor thing, the last few months, I've been really involved in the Zoran campaign in New York City where I live, and it's the same fucking demographics. It's like young working class people who hate the billionaire class, they're leaving it. And so to me, it shows again, there's actually a very wide, untapped, mostly layer of young people who want to change the world, who haven't found an outlet for obvious reasons through the Democratic Party establishment with its genocide and all of that, and who are looking for something. The labor movement has been that something over the last few years, and I think that, again, Zoran gives a peek of what that could be when we organize it. The distributed momentum organizing, maybe to define that for people who don't know a little bit. Do you want to define it, or should I? So the short version is, distributed organizing is shorthand for a type of organizing that relies a lot more on volunteers than staff. And the best examples that people talk about distributed organizing, or the ones that people point to a lot, were like maybe the early Obama campaign, the Bernie campaign, the Sunrise Movement. In many ways, I would say, my book is saying, well, how would you implement this type of model for labor? Which is true. The Emergency Workplace Organizing Committee, which I come out of and I helped co-found, is based off of, we've organized tens of thousands of workers, and it's mostly through volunteers. So the argument is, it turns out you can do a lot through volunteers. The difference, I think, between the model I'm arguing for and that is it's possible to do distributed organizing in a very top-down way. In which that
only how it happens, yeah.
Right, and so, the Obama campaign, or even frankly the Bernie campaign, in which, I was okay not having to make decisions. I haven't been too many DSA faction fights. I was like, okay, it's actually nice not having to fight it out right now. Just tell me who to go canvas, whatever. But for the project of building power over the long term, what the new worker organizing model has done, which is different, is it does give real agency to the volunteers and to the bodies of organization that you're building. It's not just a kind of staff driven at the top, but then giving small tasks locally to people to pass out flyers. It's creating hubs of organizers locally who have agency. And I think that's really important for the first piece that we talked about, which is that the only way you build a mass movement is if you're training large numbers of people to feel like they have agency and the capacity to change the world. And the problem with the distributed model, as it's normally done, is that you're not really giving the space for people to develop themselves as organizers and trainers in the way that you can do through this type of organizing. So I do think that in this sense, worker-to-worker unionism shows also the way forward for the rest of the social movements, and I try to make that case in the book, which is you need these large-scale models, but it can't just be that a couple staffers up top are just telling everyone what else to do and giving them a form to fill out. There has to be some sort of synthesis.
Yeah, I always feel like with distributed, it's always just volunteers. There's never a moment to become a member of either the campaign or an organization. You're never on a path to do that. And then the biggest thing is that if you're on a distributed campaign, the people who are in charge, and this is usually, especially in an electoral world, they can just turn off. They can just turn, you can never turn the campaign into an organization. It just turns it off. And then you got to start all over, start from scratch and all that.
You remember after Bernie in 2020, I was a labor organizer with Bernie campaign. We were begging the campaign, be don't destroy this massive army of volunteers. Please keep it going. And it didn't really happen. So I think it's just what you're saying. Even on the left, we don't fully absorb that.
And I just want to say, even Jesse Jackson pretended to have a campaign operation afterwards, unlike Sanders. Okay. I think, how would you say worker-to-worker organizing that is different from or in relation to rank and file strategy? And what we understand. From the rank and file strategy and what you understand like what happens in labor notes. And I mean, there's of course the first obvious difference of these are folks who are, a lot of times they're usually already in unions and then they're going against leadership. But there's other elements of labor notes that's just like for new worker organizing. I guess how would you situate worker organizing with rank and file strategy, and especially in relation then to its socialist politics and socialist roots also?
Yeah, it's hard to define the rank and file strategy. It's a little bit like somebody asks you, like, what's the definition of socialism? You're like, okay, well, I can give you the 10 different versions.
The solidarity version.
Yeah, right.
The original, yeah.
So I'm gonna like a little punt on the rank and file, what exactly that definition means, but I will say that the thrust of the people who've been arguing for the rank and file strategy, which is something I agree with, in its 10 different versions, is that basically, I think the operating assumption to a large extent was we need to transform the existing labor unions through running caucuses, booting out the old bureaucracy, turn them into fighting powerhouses, and then that in turn will give us the resources and the capacity to then go organize the rest of the class. I think that was the sort of operating strategic assumption. In a certain sense, I fundamentally agree with that. There's a lot to be said about that. And one of the things in the book I try to show is the extent to which, many of the most successful labor organizing drives of the last 3 or 4 years have come out of reformed unions. So, obvious example would be the auto workers. Sean Fain gets elected, very much like a labor notes crew gets elected. They go out and organize the first, major factory in the South, auto factory to win, Volkswagen. And then do ambitious new organizing. But it's not just that. The News Guild, which is the union I focus on, maybe even the most in the book, came out of very much this case where workers self-organized a campaign for the Los Angeles Times, and they ran against the incumbent, won the leadership, built a member organizing program nationwide to sort of replicate this bottom-up organizing. So in that sense, I do think that the strategy I'm articulating in the book very much goes in the spirit of, you do need to transform the unions. Like, the unions have so many resources that they're doing almost nothing with right now, that you can't win, in my view, without transforming the labor movement and the unions. So I think that's right. The problem, I think, in the way that it's been practiced is that there's been a dramatic undervaluing of new organizing. I think that this is the thing. I don't think you can be able to transform the labor movement at the scale we need without a huge number of new workers coming in via organizing. Their workplaces are going out and salting. And you need that influx of energy to make it possible for us to, for instance, to give an example, the UFCW is one of the, on an international level, is one of the worst unions in the US. It sits on the most amount of money. There's so many young retail workers and meatpacking workers who deserve so much better. And the union, like, frankly, the leadership is really bad. But how are you going to get enough workers in that union to be able to transform it, given the obstacles, and there's a big bureaucratic obstacles? Well, you need an influx of young, it doesn't have to just be young, but you need an influx of fighters and people who with energy, who've experienced a different type of unionism, who are willing to push back. And the way that you get that is by literally what we're seeing right now in the UFCW, in which you have workers organized REIs all across the country, and now they're waging a battle within their union for a more different organizing approach. And you see that, all across the board. And so I think you need the influx of this new organizing to be able to make the promise of transforming the labor movement better. And then it's a real dialectical, reciprocal thing, where the better unions help support new organizing, and that in turn gives you the people power to overcome the bureaucracy.
So the plan is for Starbucks to get a contract and then run against the leadership of SEIU, and then, no, I'm totally.
Well, I cannot say anything specific on that, but I will say that that is not entirely wrong. But yeah, I cannot neither confirm or deny. Yeah, sure.
I know we're running close on time. I have 2 more questions, one on salting and then one on concentration. So I guess for the salting one, how do you see the relationship between SALT and worker-to-worker organizing? Because then that's a little bit different than just leftists who are already in workplaces doing, they don't really have it, they're not going to join, and then they're going to organize their place versus, hey, we're going to organize my systematically place folks in key. And I don't know, do you see it as like putting folks in key industries or just wherever they want to go? Yeah, just how you see all that working.
Yeah, I think salting is really important. I mean, one of the, other than supporting the federal workers, one of the main things I've done over the last half year is trying to help DSA build up its new salting program, which is called Workers Organizing Workers, and which incidentally, if any of you are looking for a job or trying to figure out how you can make the biggest impact in the world, please actually do come up and talk to me afterwards, and we'll get you connected and help you salt. So which is to say, yeah, we have a really high need for more salts, and one of the things that we saw over the last few years is salts were really important in some of the most high-profile of these campaigns. Starbucks famous, or maybe not that famously, but Starbucks was initiated by salts in Buffalo. That's who started it, and then it went viral. But salt played a really important role in JFK, Amazon win in Staten Island. And I think that we're gonna need not just salting, but we need like large-scale salting. This is my pitch. This is what I imagine needs to happen over the next 2 years if we can do it right, which is young people understand that the world is really messed up. They see Trump, they see the billionaires, and people feel despair. They're like, what can we do? There's genocide. I think we were even like texting about this a couple months ago. It's just like, what do you do when the world is so horrific? And you just feel like horrible about yourself and the world because you don't feel like you can do anything. You basically need to be able to make the case to people and prove that the labor movement is your best path towards ending all of that, to changing all of that, right? The labor movement is the place through which you can stop climate catastrophe, you can stop militarism and genocide, you can defeat the billionaire class. And so part of that is, I think, building up a large-scale salting program in which it becomes much more normal if you're a young person coming out of high school or coming out of college to know that you can go get a job in a strategic industry, a strategic company to help unionize it. Because right now you have to maybe sort of be like a labor nerd like people in this room and you maybe have some sense of it, but it's not like widely known that this is something you can do. And I think that we have the possibility of doing that. And I think that part of it is doing like 1,000 classroom presentations, but also it's just like being really public about the importance of salting and going on the podcast circuits. There's all these there's a bunch of different left podcasts and just saying, this is why salting is important, and this is how you can get involved, making it really easy. Because right now it's actually kind of hard. You need to know people because it's too underground, which I understand why there's an ethos of you don't want to be too public about this stuff. But the companies, honestly, the companies know people are salting. That we're not like tricking anybody about the absence or not of salts, and they always accuse us of being a third party anyway. Like they're going to do that. What we actually need is numbers, and we need like excitement around it, and to get people to feel like it's viable. So I do think that that's one of the big things DSA and the left generally needs to do is like large-scale salting. And yeah, I don't think it's just Starbucks, obviously, but I think that there's a huge possibility for salts in organizing like the battery plants for in auto. So auto plants generally, but all of these new battery plants that are all over the South. Because I think that there's a lot of young people who understand the scale and urgency of the climate crisis and be like, okay, you want to stop that? What we need to do is create good, climate jobs so that people understand that the, big pro Green New Deal means being pro-worker. Like we need to make these really good jobs so that the right wing doesn't have an argument against it. And the way you can do that is by unionizing that industry, because it's not solar, wind, and battery plants, and then auto, with all the transitions, they're not unionized in the South, and we need to make them union so that that's the force to fight for the Green New Deal that we believe in. So I think that part of it is also speaking to that, underlying impetus.
Yeah, the 1930s would not have happened unless we had socialist parties and also Communist Party had a systemic salting program, in addition to like just the workers who were participants of, their party being worked in various key industries. So that's always we didn't staff our way to those wins at all.
Right.
Yeah. So I think the last question, then we'll open it up to the audience. And I think that Ben Fong had written about this. Peter only had written about this in response to your book. But I think just like I would agree with what's been said in response that it's in some ways with this reading, like where do you hold the concentration strategy, which is, people have different versions or definitions of it, but basically, labor organizing, we have to focus on key industries where workers usually have more leverage at the workplace, and that industry has more leverage over the powers that be so that they go to, so, things like nowadays it'd be things like hospitals, things like schools, higher ed, and then of course factories though too still. So versus like, what you were saying and a lot of the case studies you lifted up, which was places like Starbucks, or I have a big criticism of 5 for 15, even when it was more of like traditional union organizing campaign, was the issue was that it was McDonald's, which is, people don't view that as a strategic location for workers. So.
Yeah, so it's a good question. Yeah, so to what extent are you focused on concentrated targeting versus a more like widespread or hot shop dynamic? A few things I would say is, like, as I maybe just gleaned from talking about salting a lot, when you're doing a salting program, for instance, you don't just say, well, go anywhere you want. Like, the whole point is trying to get them into strategic industry. So, in a basic sense, I feel like the debate is stupid because, at least the polemics against me is like, I don't know what you're talking about. Like, I'm spending a lot of time trying to get people into strategic jobs, and I try to make that case in the book. And it's true. If you are like a young leftist and you're trying to figure out consciously, where can I go to be the most effective? Yeah, you should go to a place where you're going to get the most bang for your buck, right? You're not going to go salt necessarily the local bakery. That wouldn't necessarily be the smartest thing to do. That being said, is a question of what are the most strategic industries? Because this is where it becomes a little bit trickier. Everyone has different ideas for this, and it's interesting because in the 1930s, there wasn't really debate over what the strategic industries were, because it was obvious. It was like, big mass production. And so that itself should give you some indication that actually the political economy has shifted a lot since the 1930s. And so, in a certain sense, that's obvious, but people haven't fully absorbed that, because then what is your criteria for what's strategic? And that's actually, we should need to think that through. Is it just the economic leverage? Well, the reasons that big factories were important wasn't just that it was the economic leverage, it's also, that was the biggest industries. Like, you had 30-40% of the entire working class working there. So just huge numbers of workers, right? It was also that these were the most visible targets and the biggest companies. So it's the criteria also maybe that you need the high visible targets that can inspire other people, or that have the most amount of money to cough up. Starbucks, for instance, is small workplaces, but it's a big company that has money to cough up, right? Even though the workplaces are small. So the criteria for what you're choosing to be strategic matters a lot. And so I think that we just have to, I think, be really rigorous about what we consider to be strategic. If we look at a recent period, the operating assumption that, for instance, strategic means just the place that has the most economic disruptive power, I don't think that that's been proven, that that's the only criteria for strategy, which is the way people talk about it a lot. So the thing that really revived the labor movement over the last 10 years or last 5 years, however you want to look at it, was the teachers movement. So you can start CTU in 2012, and then the 2018 teacher strikes. Like, that was the first glimmer that got people excited about the labor movement, and it put a lot of other things into motion. And so there's no economic, there's not really, it's a public sector workforce. It's disruptive socially, right? You're creating a social crisis, but that's a different criteria. And so actually, you need to have a really kind of varied level of what you're thinking to be strategic. And again, if you look to the teachers, maybe as an example, you wouldn't consider this in the 1930s as strategic industry. The Communist Party was not sending salts into teaching. But one commonality, and I'll bring this, is that we underestimate the extent to which in the 1930s people won it not just because of disruptive leverage, but because they created a social crisis, which is to say, in a political crisis. And this is something that I think is a commonality with Starbucks or some of these other retail places, or the teachers which they had to bring in the community. It was also the case in the 1930s that in the places where, even in workers with strategic power, they got crushed over and over and over again if they didn't have the community on their side. And so even in the 1930s, even when you had the most amount of immediate disruptive power, you still needed to have this widespread community support. And I think that basically that is still, and even more so, the case today. If you're in the public sector, you need the community, but also if you're in a place like Starbucks, you need the community to threaten to boycott, or to actually boycott because of Gaza, and it cost the company $13 billion. So I think that both in the past and today, it is still the case that you need a broad level of political community support. So when you're figuring out targets, you do need to have not just economic leverage, but something that's going to capture people's imagination, that's a high-profile target, that's going to generate excitement and momentum. And I think that that's part of the reason why going after these big retail companies is crucial. And the last thing I would say just on this is that even in this company that everyone talks about as the most strategic, which I think is basically true, which is Amazon. So Amazon is clearly like destroying us all, and it's destroying the labor movement, it's destroying the economy. So we need to be able to unionize Amazon. The necessity for doing the type of worker-to-worker, more scattershot organizing that I articulate in the book, where it's not just you choosing which workplace, but you're trying to do what I call seeding, in which you're creating the conditions and the tools through which people can start self-organizing. Well, you need to do that at Amazon too. So it's not. You can't really counterpose the model I'm arguing to even these strategic companies, because Amazon has thousands of workplaces. And if you look at where in the world where they've actually won a first contract at Amazon, like you can look at Italy. To me, this is how you get a first contract. They struck every single delivery center in Italy. They struck every single delivery center. This is a scale problem. It's fundamentally a question of scale. You had to organize their tens of thousands of different workers, maybe it was actually hundreds of thousands, to be able to force the company to the table. And so there isn't in the network of these logistic industries, there isn't just like this one nodal point where if you just get this one hub, you're gonna be able to bring the company to the table. So you need to find a mechanism for scaling, even within the strategic companies, that makes it impossible to just do salting and concentrate. You need to have mechanisms through which you're doing mass scale trainings, in which you have high publicity wins, in which you're giving tools to workers to reach out. Essentially all of these mechanisms for what we would call like seeding or distributed organizing, even within the companies you're targeting. So that's my rant slash defense of the strategy. Thank you.
Yeah, no, there's always, the funniest thing about how people talk about the concentration strategy back in the day is they always just kind of submerge the stories of, there's like a Black organizer from Chicago, Eleanor Rye, started out on the Women's Auxiliary Club of Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, then did Sopkin's textile, whatever, for the garment workers, and for like the tool union at the time, and then eventually did steel workers and organized, what was Gary, Indiana Steel. But, that person needed all those other experiences to get ready for steel, like the battle that was in the Memorial Day Massacre that was steel organizing versus the other things. And that's what, the concentration program also had strategies and like plans for that, so that people I think sometimes forget. Okay, we're gonna open it up to folks. Just come up to the mic. If it's a comment, if you could just keep it like 1 minute to 2 minutes. If it's an actual comment getting to a question, then 3 minutes. We'll do 3 at a time, and then we'll circle it out like that. Cool?
So I'm a public school teacher in Virginia, so having read State Revolt and just sort of being very aware of, Virginia's failure to strike at that time, and then just the shortcomings and failures of that movement at the time. Do you have any thoughts about organizing in largely conservative areas, knowing what we know now, just like a postscript almost?
Mm-hmm.
Thanks.
Jason, can I suggest that maybe Bill gets a chance?
Yeah. Bill, come on up. Bill, come on up. You can make room for Bill, and then you can bring the microphone over to him.
Some advantages of being disabled.
Hey, Bill.
Get on the plane quicker. So, much thanks. Hopefully you can hear me through the mask. I've known Eric for a few years. Just a couple quick comments. One, in terms of a historical reference, I would often want people to think about the late 60s, early 70s, and what happened. That led to a massive labor upsurge, and that was led by young people. Now, there's some obvious differences. One was the immediate experience of the Black liberation civil rights movement. We saw that very strongly in Detroit, and the anti-war movement. So we had a rich soil to plant in. And without making any judgments on where things were concentrated, we had some important victories in terms of accumulating labor content. But then we ran into, obviously, neoliberalism, and I think people were not yet anticipating that things would shift that quickly. I do think, though, that now, I notice, I sound Pollyannish, we're beginning to accumulate enough people on the ground that we can have a soil that we can plant in. It's not as easy now in terms of the obvious targets other than Amazon. But I do think that, there has to be some conscious decision, but we also have to look to where there's already organic organizing going on. And the last thing I'll say is, as much as I like to book on red states and teachers, there was a lot of work that had been done long before that. As you know, I'm a long-time activist in the NEA. There's been organizing going back, to some of the big battles in public education, and especially once there was an effort to impose neoliberal model on public education. So they go hand in hand, and it's still the case now. And it's still what teachers are in the battle. Thanks.
Thanks, Bill.
Hi, thank you. So Lenin has this famous criticism about like economism. Is like when workers are only they're only like unionizing, they only care about the economic demands. Like, okay, we want to pay more, but not actually like the targeting at the political demands in the back, which is the actual issue of the society, like the capitalism. So how do you, I was in a grad student union, and it's the same. Like when we went struck and we reached and the university agreed on our salaries, and we realized, okay, like our labor organizers were very progressive. We were like, okay, we need to actually defund the police, etc., etc. But when we reached the point of the salary increase, we were like, okay, let's like ratify this contract. So how do you think unionism? How do you think we can overcome this economism side aspect of the unionism, and like how do you think the union can serve the revolution instead of just very liberal, we get paid more? Okay, that's my question.
Sure. So yeah, what to do in largely conservative areas? Yeah, it's a good question. I think good organizing is always context specific, and so that is maybe sometimes underestimated. I do think that good organizing, the techniques and the methods are the same, but actually, you do have to meet workers where they're at. You have to find out in the pockets where you're organizing, what are the things that are going to unite people, but also like fire people up. So for instance, it might be the case on a statewide movement in West Virginia or Arizona, the things that really brought everyone together was more funding for schools, right? And that was something that was unifying, but it was also implicitly anti-racist because most of the students in these places, it's disproportionately Black and brown students. So there's a ways of even these broad universal things in red states that can still people rally around, go against the grain of the conservative sort of ideology against public sector and all of that. It might also be the case that there's pockets of workers in conservative areas that are like really fired up around more specific issues. So for instance, like Starbucks Workers United is spread all across the South, and those are mostly queer, like overwhelmingly queer young workers. And so for them, the issue of like the company not living up to its promise around being nominally progressive was really crucial, like really, really central. And so a lot of these came out of Black Lives Matter and different sort of like queer politics. And there's pockets in conservative areas of workers who can organize all around different issues as well. I will say that, so you have to really look at which workers you're talking about. It's hard to generalize too much. I would say though that one of the things, if I were to like write Red State Revolt again, which is for people who knows the book I wrote about the teacher strikes in 2018, I actually do think that part of the reason I became more interested in politics since then is that the experience there seems to suggest that even the like really militant statewide strikes in contexts in which the entire political apparatus is going to come after you afterwards, it's hard to sustain that organizing momentum. It's just really hard. And so you can compare Arizona, which is more of like a purple state now, where the organizing has been able to sustain itself with West Virginia and Oklahoma, where just they won amazing strikes and then fucking got crushed afterwards. And not even immediately. In West Virginia, they had another strike the next year. People forget this, that they won, and then finally, over the summertime, like conservatives got it together. They're like, oh, it turns out when we try to destroy the teachers' union, we should do it not during the school year, but in the summertime, and people, when they can't strike. And then they did that, and they things are worse for the schools in West Virginia than before. So I do think that, and this is scary to me, but it's also part of the reason I'm more open to feeling like we need to be part of a broad anti-Trump, bloc, broadly speaking, than I used to. Is that, it's really hard to sustain working class power when you have people in power just trying to destroy you all the time, which is different than just like bad Democrats. When they're just actively trying to destroy you, it's harder. And so I do think part of it is tying our organizing to a political project that can destroy MAGA, you know what I mean? And that can push them out and that can undermine that. So I do think that you can't just win through unions. And so maybe that goes to the second question as well, as like economism. I'm not a big fan of this critique. Apart from like the historiography stuff on Lenin, which we can dig into at another juncture, but in my experience with struggles radicalizing, experience of fighting the boss is a profoundly politicizing and radicalizing experience. And so it's true, you might not get all workers to sign up for Marxism by the end, but that's a pretty high expectation for what you would expect any struggle. I'm not sure there's another thing, that you get more successful in radicalizing workers than fighting the boss. In my experience, this is the best way for people to get the experience that we're part of a class and that the enemy is the bosses, and that we have solidarity. So I think it can be a profoundly politicizing thing, even if it's around bread and butter issues. This has been my experience. It's not inevitable, and so you need leftists in there to draw to connect the dots. But I would say, broadly speaking, I'm sympathetic to your approach, which is for the earlier reason as well, is that most unions do politics really fucking badly, which is to say that they are so stupid so narrow-minded about how they're doing politics that it's profoundly impacted the ability of the labor movement to grow. Part of the reason why the labor movement is 6% of the public in the private sector, only 10% nationwide, is that the labor movement overwhelmingly has just tied its fate to begging the Democrats to give us something, and that is not a winning strategy, is the nicest way to say that. And just to give an example, maybe things are changing, but I would say it's not just a question of how we convince people support the revolution, though. Hopefully do that to a certain extent. It's we couldn't even get most unions to endorse Zoran Mamdani in New York City. We fought hard, but we succeeded in getting some unions. But just to give you an example, they endorse fucking Andrew Cuomo. It's the worst, the devil. You can endorse the devil? Why? So that's the baseline that we're at. And so part of the fight, and this is why the politics is also, it goes to the earlier question, politics is also, trying to get unions to essentially support anti-corporate candidates is really, really useful, not just for what that would mean for the politics of the world, but even within the labor movement. Because you had so many rank and file workers in New York City who were pissed at their union leadership for endorsing Andrew Cuomo. So much so that when Zoran won, the next day you saw these same unions that had endorsed Cuomo, almost the next day after, maybe 2 days after, were long live Zoran, long live the Cuomo here, right? Because they realized that the ranks had been organizing and were they were about to get steamrolled by them. So I would say that there's a... What's that?
In 1199 had just had an internal election too.
Right, exactly. So 32VJ, HTC, some of these big unions, are now. What's that? Yeah. So now they've endorsed. So I would say that there's a way of using the political battles that I think we need to have to fight against the Democratic Party establishment to rebuild a rank and file culture and democratic political engagement within the ranks of the unions as well.
Okay. I'm a wind turbine technician, and I attended an EWOC course, and it felt very focused on a lot of university organizing and creating universities or creating unions in more white collar spaces, and it was hard for me to really seem to use it in my own workplace. So my question is there a talk at EWOC about creating trainings for more blue collar workplaces? And then also, what you said about salting answers my question. I do want to become a salt. I'm very interested in that. And I also wanted to ask, for my industry, I care a lot about it. I believe in it, and it's under attack by the administration. but it's also one of the fastest growing industries in the country, so there's a lot of different things going on. And then it also generally pays well, and you know, because there's not enough of us, so the pay is generally higher. I just need help figuring out these different things, and I need help with the specifics of my industry, knowing what to do and when to do it. Does that make sense? Thank you.
Hi everyone, my name is Elena. I'm here in Chicago. I'm a social worker. Our Chicago DSA labor branch did a wonderful sort of group read of the book. Absolutely phenomenal. I really appreciate it. And now that I've said some nice things, I'm going to very nicely and gently kick the beehive a little bit. So your again, you've done a really great job, and like other people have really been articulating a worker-to-worker organizing model where workers can really gain a lot of skills and really take on a lot of activities, so it's not always reliant on staffers, and where there's sort of like a democratic sharing of knowledge, skills, and expertise, which I absolutely love. But there's been like a lot of different sort of debates in the left, DSA, and many other spaces around sort of the relationship between sort of workers in a shop or people in an organization and staff unions. And so how do you sort of approach the contradiction of, you know, helping regular people build up that organizing skill and also supporting sort of staffers who again also are working, have bills to pay, and how they relate together?
Hi, I'm an employee at Amazon here in the southern suburbs. There's 45,000 Amazon workers in the 5 counties around the Chicago area. It's the biggest hub in the world. There's about 1,200 facilities, and we have 45 facilities here in the Chicagoland area. We're also, I am working, I've been there for about 8 years. It's sort of been up and down. We were working with the Teamsters, then we were working with the Amazon Labor Union out of New York. Now we're back kind of working with Amazon, but kind of indirect. The guy that I'm working with specifically is not some sort of bureaucrat out of Amazon. He's a DSA leader, and we have study groups. The political education is very important in the union movement, so that you're not just organizing for the bureaucrats, you're organizing for the socialist revolution. And the working class, when they strike, we have the most powerful, tool the working class has, the strike. We can shut them all down. The billionaires make every single nickel off of our labor. So right now, I know a lot of people here are from out of state, which is great. We have a whole national organization, movement here. But if there anybody here, would like to salt in any of the facilities in Amazon in the Chicagoland area, just call the DSA and ask to talk with a fellow named George. He's a fantastic guy. He's a young guy, and as you were saying, the youth is really powerful. Where I work, we're black, white, and Latino. I think only about 20% white. It's all kind of, it's a very, racially diverse group, and they're young people. I'd say the average age is, 25, 30. There's a few older people, but it's a movement of young youth again. And it's great to hear you say that there is a little confusion in the youth, but I think it's getting straightened out because our living standards are declining because of the inflation and so on. People are getting pissed. I'm a retired steelworker and a machinist, and a journeyman machinist. When I was working, it was $100,000 a year, and you look at inflation and so on. The average working class, about 60% of the American workforce were making $100,000 a year. That was the famous American middle class, and now I'm making 25,000, 30,000, and so there's a lot of organizing to do, but there's a huge future, a powerful future. So, like I say, anybody that's young, call DSA and get in on our salting movement here in the Chicagoland area. Thanks.
My name's Russ Gilbert. I'm with the group called Speak Out Socialists, and I want to pick up on a theme that's come through here, which is that there's a real need to couple the best from below organizing with a political perspective. I live in Raleigh, North Carolina. There is no way that we're going to win over workers who are not experienced with unions unless we address the absolute absence of a political voice for workers. That's not going to come through the Democratic Party. I think we're all in agreement with that, but then there's the logic of that question is what do we do about it, and is it urgent to propose a vision of not only worker power at the shop floor level, but worker power in society. We can't do that without raising the question of an independent workers' party. And it needs a program. And yes, the program has to do what you said. It has to both unite people and inspire people. But those programmatic questions are absolutely dead in the water unless you propose a vehicle for which workers can independently assert themselves in politics. Because that's a key to changing the direction of society. And if there's a problem with what you guys are saying today, it's that we're not addressing the urgency of projecting worker power in the society grounded in and in collaboration with worker power at the point of production. I think that the left is going to continue to be hobbled to the extent that it delays coming to terms with that question. We're going to see the limits, I think, of working in the Democratic Party, whether Madani is elected or not, just like we saw the limits of the Bernie campaign. The Democratic Party is an instrument for crushing independent working class power, as well as an instrument for ideologically confusing the working class. And I really think our speakers ought to address the question of politics along with the question of union organizing.
Thank you.
I'm Grant from Los Angeles. I'm a union organizer in mainly higher education. I do think there's the question of, just to quickly respond, because now I'm thinking about the last commenter, there's questions about like forming our own party, but I also think the way that, like, respectfully, that we are talking about that, but from the position we are in, where there is like a crisis of leadership in the labor movement, and that there is not what I have seen a like strong left leadership that can pose that question seriously. There's barely enough leadership to be able to say, like, we should have a general strike in 2028. I think that's a great progression from before that call was made. But what I've noticed on like organizing drives is, one, what you were talking about of like leaders developing leaders, workers developing workers, and learning the skills of staff. I saw that happen organizing about 3,000 workers. I was one of 5 staff people on it. I was totally overwhelmed, felt like we need more staff, but we worked a program where we were able to work with workers and teach them, and they of course teaching us on like how to best train new workers in the workplace. And I think a key part of why it was successful was going after the current leaders in the workplace, which ran along all ideological lines in a very contentious workplace in higher education, but that it would not have worked if we didn't recruit those actively willing to organize around those issues. And for that reason, like, what I saw on a lot of organizing committees was there were those that did the work and talked about the work, and those that wanted to come and talk about a program for the union. And it was incredibly frustrating, although I found myself politically agreeing with them, but they were not willing to talk to their coworkers, and I think that's exactly why we need to find leaders that are left-wing that are willing to talk with those not like them. And my question for you is like, what does the process look like, if there is one, to bring leaders from one new organizing campaign into another one in a serious manner that's not like, here's what we did, it was great, good luck.
Yeah, so really good questions. On the blue collar question, I'm sure you had, wherever the comment was, I'm sure you had that experience. You know, my experience in New York, like the first campaign I ever supported were meatpacking workers in Pennsylvania. So it actually there are a lot of blue collar workers, and so maybe it was the specific training you were in. But I think, which is, and also for what's worth, EWOC is it's a project of DSA and the United Electrical Workers Union, which is primarily still a blue collar union. So the organizing experience that we're trying to pass on comes out of actually the left industrial blue collar tradition. So I think that the organizing method is actually the same fundamentally as how you're developing leaders. But we do have a real problem, which is that the left, and EWOC is very much a project of the left, is disproportionately college educated. And I think we need to be really sober about the extent to which our politics currently in the US and much of the world tends to self-select into people who've been to college or certain white-collar workers. I think it's really important to own that these are still members of the working class. Part of the argument of the right wing is like, oh, the professionals, these are the oppressors. No, I think that the working class is white-collar, is blue-collar. We need to have that vision of uniting people. But similar, we need to understand our weak link right now is amongst blue-collar, non-educated workers. And so we need to have a very proactive strategy, which is one of the reasons why what the United Auto Workers is doing is so exciting, it's so important, because that union has both historic legitimacy and the resources to go out and organize the South with workers who are not coming to socialism, for the most part. So I think that is a strategic place to focus, and we need to be really proactive about it. On the staffers question, Elena, whoever asked that question, I thought your question was going to be so much more mean. You really, I was really scared. Yeah, it was an extremely nice question. The staffing question is really important. It's funny, maybe it's just the way we talk about it, but this is, one of the reasons I wrote the book was actually to make a case for the possibility of a more bottom-up organizing approach that isn't just saying we don't need staffers. My argument actually is very explicit, and I don't think maybe it came across so much in the talk here, but I actually am arguing against a left tradition that says we don't need established unions, we don't need staffers. And I actually explicitly argue in the book we need a lot more staffers. In an aggregate, we need to hire way more staffers. But the problem is we need those staffers to be able to relate to workers in a more scalable way, in a way that's giving them the tools and helping pass on this training without being the intensive organizing approach that was described earlier, where you're really almost micromanaging every union job, because it's not sustainable and it's not scalable that way. So I actually think staffers are incredibly important, and that what we should be replicating, and the things I point to in the book, are more like Starbucks Workers United, the News Guild, in which staffers are building up the back-end infrastructure for a member-to-member organizing program. But for that to happen, you do need a lot of back-end staff support. And that's one of the things I think we need to be talking about with staffers. It's not are staffers good or not. Staffers are essential. The question is, what is the role of staffers for helping build up a type of program that can win big? And that is different. And some staffers are not used to that. Some staffers are used to doing everything on their own, and we need to teach them good organizing is not doing stuff on your own. It's helping train workers, not just to be able to do it, but that workers can teach other workers. And that's the thing where even good organizers who know how to train workers and how to win often don't know how to train workers and how they can teach other people to win. And that is a new skill set. I think that's really important. And then on the question of the age-old question, I feel like I've never been able to do a panel in which we haven't had this debate on the Democratic Party. I would just say I really agree with what the comrade said of, the first thing I would say to leftists before we, feel like we can just create the Labor Party tomorrow, because I would love to see a Labor Party, is can you organize your coworkers? But literally, have you organized your coworkers to build a union? Have you organized your coworkers to go out on strike? Have you organized your union to be able to even endorse an anti-establishment primary candidate, right? Which is an easier lift, but still quite a hard lift. I can say, there's been real hard fights in New York City to get unions to endorse somebody running as a Democrat, which is Zoran, because he has, he's a socialist and he's, anti-genocide. If you can't win those battles, it's very hard for me to imagine that we'll have the power to form a new party before we can scale up the union movement to be bigger. The union movement is 6%. What world are we going to have a labor party if the labor movement is only 6% of the private sector? And then second, if we can't wage the battle where workers are currently, you'd be surprised. It's hard enough to get workers, when you got young, it's hard enough to get them to go out and support an in New York City right now. Like I spent a lot of time, it's all I've been doing the last month. A lot of working class people, particularly in working class communities of color, have some sort of residual affection for Andrew Cuomo. We actually have to wage that battle. It's not the case that everyone is just rip-roaring to go to form a new party and the only thing is blocking it is the bad bureaucrats. It's just not the case. I don't think that's the train we're on. So we need to create the conditions through which we're strong enough to be able to have the mass working class party that we need. Thank you. Appreciate that.
Hi, my name is Gabe Perez. I'm the chairperson of the CTU Bilingual Education Committee, and we've just been in bargaining for 14 months and won a really historic contract. I would say the bargaining we just did, the bargaining I just did as part of a team would have been impossible if it had not been for strong staffers, because teaching is exhausting and bargaining is exhausting. And when you put those two things together, we need strong staffers to keep us alive and going. I want to share that I came into teaching in Chicago public schools as a bilingual teacher, mostly with migrant kids, in 2013. 2013 was the year right after the historic strike when Rahm Emanuel shut down 50 schools, primarily on the south and west side of Chicago. They were shooting for 150 schools and they shut down 50. It was also a time when AUSL, which was a school turnaround model, one of these Ed D4 models where they basically fire en masse everybody from the principal down to the lunch ladies, primarily targeting veteran teachers of color and replacing them with young white teachers who are willing to do whatever their principal says to do. That's how I came into teaching. I would say that when we came in 2013 and I became a school delegate straight out of college, the only job I've ever had is CPS, it seemed hopeless, right? It seemed like we were kicked on our asses and we had nothing we could do to fight it. What came from that was the only movement and the first movement in the US to unionize charter schools. They wanted to do in Chicago what they did in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina, which is completely gut the public education system. In Chicago, they did roll out many charter campuses. Now we have unionized those charter buildings, right? And there was some discussion about that. Are we against charters or are we for charters? We are steadfast against charters, but we're for the workers and teachers and students who go to those charter schools, right? And what I was thinking, what many of us were thinking is, do they want to be unionized, right? Have they drunk the Kool-Aid of the charter world? And what we found is that the most militant union activists are actually the ones coming from the charter schools, because believe it or not, many of them have worse teaching and working conditions than we do in the public school system, with less than half the pay in many cases, without special education support, without support for English language learners, and without a union, right? So the dynamic of whether they want to be organized, once we realized the conditions in which we were organizing those people, it came organically. Yes, they are some of our strongest union activists today. And I think there's a connection to the working class in the US today. We're going to see the very few protections that American workers have gutted from the Trump administration, right? So what's going to come of this actual objective fall in the condition of working people in the United States? Are we going to fall into nihilism and despair and more MAGA? Or are we going to fall into a popular left movement that does not let go of social issues and does not let go of economic populism, instead merges those two things together, like we saw in the victory of Zorhan in New York City, right? So the last thing I'll say is that on top of worker-to-worker connections, we need caucus politics to be strong in our union places, because in the same way people get angry at their bosses and organize to the left, there are always those voices in our union that will get angry at their bosses and organize for the reactionary wing of workers. So our caucuses need to be ready, we need to be sharp, we need to be able and ready to bargain for housing, for education, for healthcare, for racial justice, environmental justice, and migrant justice. And anything short of that is us giving ground to the reactionary forces in our union and our country.
Hi guys, how you doing? My name is Jorge. I Nicholas. I represent the International Alliance's Reform Caucus. We're an entertainment union. That being said, we worked closely with some of the folks you've mentioned, the UAWD folks. We worked pretty closely with them since their dissolution and a little bit before to try to model how we've organized. It's just something that I've noticed, and actually, Grant here was one of my teachers back in the day, so kudos to Grant. It's one thing that I guess we've noticed in our organizing with some of these folks is at the very top of the now existing leadership, the way in which the UAW conducted itself in its dissolution was super undemocratic. And it's something that wasn't really talked about that much. It hasn't really been brought up that much, but I guess it leads into some of the other things that the comrades here talked about and dug into, which is sort of the limitations of strictly reform-minded organizing and how it absolutely created the conditions that led to it. And even almost tried to obscure those things, and I guess it's concerning for me. And also, we have comrades in the Reform Caucus and the electrical workers as well, but it's extremely concerning to them as well, as to how do we avoid some of those conditions that led to the dissolution in these other Reform Caucuses. And also, if any of you guys are in a Reform Caucus, you should reach out to me, because we're trying to organize collectively on the Reform Caucus level. Yeah, I guess that's my big concern is how do we avoid that, and what are the limitations of reform politics, and how does revolutionary politics in workplace organizing sort of act as a counterbalance to those sort of reactionary tendencies, even within perfectly well-intentioned leftists. Thank you.
My name is Madeline. I am from Detroit, Michigan, and I just want to say a couple of things I appreciated about your talk and book is, first of all, the sort of, I guess, undoing like the pitting of the like rank and file strategy in strategic sectors against the sort of like distributed organizing model that your book describes. And it just strikes me that it's just impossible to know like when you plant seeds where they will grow. And like, just one anecdote I'll share briefly is I worked for about 5 years for the Michigan Nurses Association as an organizer and then as a labor rep, and I was bargaining a contract in a hospital in a rural part of the state. And like, I want to say it was like, we were caucusing one day and a member of the bargaining team was reading a book on the French Revolution, and he's like, you guys, like, have you ever heard of this concept of the proletariat? And I swear, everyone, all 8 of them were like, no, what's that? And flash forward, 5 months later, we had a informational picket, and one of them had a huge sign that said, the proletariat will eat the bourgeoisie. And I was just like, they didn't win a very strong contract, but so anyway, I appreciate your sort of like.
This is a polemic against the revolutionary comrades in the room.
No, but you know, economists. Anyway, I appreciate that response. My one question, and this isn't the most important thing in the world, but I am just curious if since publishing this book, you've had any like unions reach out to you and say like, wow, it really seems like there's something there. We want to learn more. Thank you.
Hey everybody, my name is Lucy, and first of all, thank you for this panel, and thank you so much for writing this book. I haven't read it yet, but I am very excited to read it because I think it's a really, understanding and really chronicling what's been happening with this organizing. I think is so important. I got up because 1199 in Cuomo was invoked, and I think it's related because I guess my perspective on some of this new organizing, worker organizing, is that it's just like the labor movement has such, like the established unions have such a clamp down on things and don't have a way forward, but there's so much need for organizing that it's breaking out around the edges, right? It's breaking out outside, and it's also breaking out inside the labor movement too, but especially around the edges. And I think that it's related to the issue of Cuomo and 1199. So 1199 is a huge union in New York City, and they have organized, and I'm a member, they have organized their most active members into a very top-down and limited understanding of power, I think. And so they've had a long partnership with Andrew Cuomo when he was governor, and basically the partnership is like, the hospital workers would partner with the heads of the private hospitals and Cuomo to keep Medicaid and Medicare funding flowing into New York State, right? And this was the partnership. Not at the same time, Cuomo actually cut Medicaid and Medicare, right? But it was sort of this mythology that like, this is our power. Our power is the seat at the table. And I went to event after event over the years where the president of my union would introduce Andrew Cuomo as the best friend of working people in New York City.
Oh my God.
Again and again. And so recently, when our new leadership got inducted, we had a big induction ceremony, and they invited Cuomo, and a few of us like leafleted it outside about why we should rescind our endorsement of Cuomo. When they brought Cuomo in, it was like the Beatles had come. Like people jumped out of their seats and were cheering. I mean, part of it was like just this sense of like we're this strong union, and we have this guy here, and he's our guy. You know what I mean? And this is part of our power, right? And so there's a way in which, again, I feel like the labor movement, some unions have organized workers into this, like, again, very top-down prescribed understanding of power. And the last thing I'll just say is that I think staff unions for organizers is really important, because organizers, there's a lot of organizers who want to like help their members organize and then get pushback from their bosses, right? And having a staff union actually gives them more leeway to do that sometimes.
And then, yeah, this is it, so if you want to get in now.
Hello, I'm Jay, and I'm very, very new to the labor movement, and so extremely ignorant as to theory and history. But I was just curious as to whether you think it would be more strategically advantageous to sort of reform existing unions to that worker-to-worker model, or to join and grow the ranks of an existing labor organization that already uses the solidarity unionism model, like the IWW, or both.
Hey, my name is Rami Khalil. Thank you so much for your work. I always appreciate your perspectives and your work and your ideas. I'm in my bargaining committee of my union, UFCW 663 in Minneapolis, and I'm the co-chair at the labor branch in Twin Cities DSA. And I think there is some truth in your point about if we can't even get our workers to like go on strike and do basic things like a march in the boss, then how in the world are we gonna like form a labor party right now? I think there is truth in that. Like workers' consciousness is low. Like I definitely had difficulty getting my coworkers to strike. Although I did organize a successful march in the boss, which I was proud of. And but I feel like there's an interrelationship between our. I don't think it's necessarily first we have to build the unions and then we can build a workers' party. I think there's they can interplay with each other. Like a lot of my coworkers don't care about the union because they look around at the world and they look at the political parties and political leaders and they feel like no one is fighting for them and that the world is falling to pieces. And so why should they pay attention to politics? Why should they care about their union? There's an interconnection between the political parties and any sense of hope. But like when Bernie was running, or now when Zohran was running, it gave people hope, and it also changed the debate in the country. Like instead of the debate being Iran shouldn't have a nuclear weapon, and we should negotiate with Iran rather than bomb Iran, and that's the debate between the Republicans and Democrats. When you have Bernie running or you have Zohran running, the debate becomes we deserve affordability, you know. So. And that can spur on the unions if workers feel like, yeah, we do deserve more affordability. So I feel like we shouldn't assume that first we have to build the unions, and once we get that going, that may be one path. That is a viable path, and it's certainly hard to build unions. I have no dispute with that. But I also think building a political party could help us build unions, especially if they improve the labor laws. That's another huge obstacle. Is like the Democrats, Republicans have rigged the labor laws against the working class. So I just want to throw that out for debate, camaraderie debate.
Sure.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'd love to hear your response.
Sure. Again, so this is another one of these ones where I was expecting a much harsher argument. I actually just entirely agree 100%. I actually have there's a whole chapter in my book making this case, which is, and so maybe I was not as clear as I could have been earlier. like, one of the things I try to prove in the book is the centrality of the Bernie campaign to this labor uptick, which is exactly what you're saying. And so, I agree 100%. My point wasn't that you need to do like shop floor politics and then shop floor organizing and then politics. My point was more specific that we're not going to have the power to found an entirely independent labor party before we have a lot more workers in motion. But there's a lot of politics we have to do in the meantime. And this is to me where it comes down to like insurgent primaries against the democratic establishment, Bernie, Zoran, like these are the things that we've seen. As we speak, we've seen that, yeah, actually, whether we like it or not, the first starting point for most people in this country to think about politics is electoral politics. For the vast majority of working class people, this is what they think politics is. And that's a limitation, but we have to take that for, I think, we have to understand that that is the terrain we're on. And so if we can't provide a political answer within that terrain, then it makes it much harder for us to win the battle of ideas we need, including within the unionization efforts. So yeah, 100%. I don't disagree with that, and I'm not just saying that for like debating reasons. I very explicitly agree with you, and I think we actually need to go further on that, which is to say that like part of the way we're going to revive the labor movement isn't just by more good shop floor organizing, as much as it is, but we basically need it. Yeah, we need to be able to lean on left insurgent politics. And so let me give a concrete example. For Zoran, we need to organize now literally hundreds of thousands of workers in New York City to win the affordable agenda, because the capitalist class is going to try to destroy it, right? He's going to do everything possible, they're going to do everything possible to make it impossible to pass his agenda, and the only world in which we're going to be able to stop that is if we have a massive expansion of working class organized power from below. So, one of the nice things now is that, but also we have Zorans out there with, a huge bully pulpit, in which we're already talking about how can that campaign actively help people organize unions at their workplace? How can the campaign actively help organize working class people to talk to their neighbors around these agenda points? So there's a way to use the politics, not just to inspire people, but to directly use the apparatus to support organizing. And I think that that's one of the things that I see as missing in the labor movement, even with unions that do good like field operations for electoral, and sometimes for decent campaigns, they always stop their electoral political thing after the election. This is what we need to stop. We need like the electoral to continue into a grand campaign afterwards, and I think that that's the moment we're in, which we need that to feed into labor organizing and vice versa. Just a few things on the last. I would say caucuses. Yeah, this is tricky. It's hard to talk in the abstract about it. I would just say that in the ideal world that I live in, every union we're in would be committed to the Marxist program and to fight for the abolition of capitalism, and that will be based off of our worker and our co-workers agreeing with that. It's a process to get in that direction. It's just not where we're in right now. And so I think part of the frustration with caucus politics or like reform-minded efforts is maybe not the strategy, but actually just the terrain, which is that a lot of people, including the UAW, aren't yet on board with not being racist. So we have to like have a starting point to, like, for instance, on Gaza, we need to convince people that Palestinians are human beings, right? And we might not yet be at the place where we can convince the UAW to go on a strike to stop it, but that requires us to actually go out and talk to our coworkers around these issues. And we can't impose where we think they should be and where they're at. We need it. Good organizing is based off of where people are at and moving them forward. And I feel like sometimes the frustration with reform-minded caucuses is less the strategy of those people and just the fact that in terrains where people aren't already leftist, it goes slower than we want, and it sucks. But I think that's the goal we need to get to is the same. And then the last thing on just unions reaching out. Yeah, I've been really happy about since the book came out. A bunch. I don't know where's the comrade who asked that question. So a bunch of unions have, including I guess I can name names here. So a bunch of really big unions, including like the NEA. So the NEA is the National Education Association, which is the biggest union in the country. People might not know that. Is building a member organizer program, and like I'm literally doing trainings with their national organizers on like how do you build up a member organizer program. The biggest union in the UK reached out, and even unions who I really thought disagreed with this approach. Including some in Chicago, which I won't name in case anyone's here, but are bringing me in to talk with the organizing department because they're just like, look, what we're doing is not working. We can win, but we're not winning it enough. We're not bringing in enough workers. We need to be more ambitious. And so, like, what are the lessons from the other campaign? So I think there's actually is an opening. The biggest problem in the labor movement is not that actually people are stuck on the wrong organizing model. The biggest problem is the vast majority of unions do zero organizing. And so for the people who take organizing seriously, there's an openness, not all of them, but there is a general openness to this. The unfortunate reality is the vast majority of unions are not doing organizing. So that is the big battle I think we still need to have. Thanks.
The funny thing on the UAW thing, you know, my friend was telling me like when the Biden endorsement came through, and then in their Facebook group or whatever, they're like, oh, people are really pissed about the Biden endorsement. And I was like, oh yeah, like in my lefty bubble, like, oh yeah, because of Gaza and all this other stuff. And they're like, no, because because they wanted to do Trump, like, and they were upset with there was like this Black Caucus out of UAW in the south side of Chicago. They were having an event on it, and there was a bunch of other UAW folks being like, fuck this.
100%. That was my experience. I had been on the Bernie campaign. We helped win in Nevada, so we spent like 2 months and we won. You might remember the culinary workers voted for Bernie. It was very successful, and so the Bernie campaign was like, go do your magic in Michigan. Okay, so like we go bring our team up, all the volunteers, we go to Michigan. We were literally like focusing on talking to only UAW workers. And it was fucking bleak, man. I'm just saying, that was fucking bleak, really. Honestly, so it just, you know, the train is not always as favorable as we might wish it to be, but, you know, things are moving. Yeah.
All right, give it up. Thank you.